Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started with our government operations and fiscal policy work session. Today we have one item, very important one. Let me just add that, as part of our deliberations during this year's operating budget process, the council decided to take a strategic approach to reviewing various components of the county's fiscal policies and structures, but conducted in-depth reviews on different topics. This report on OPEB is the first of these efforts, which will all be done in close collaboration with the county executive. I think Montgomery County has a track record of always taking our OPEB obligations very seriously. We were out front of other jurisdictions in the beginning to set aside funds for future retiree health benefits in the late 2000s and have done so nearly every year since, with the exception of the Great Recession years. And then recently, we've had to reduce plan contributions based on significant unanticipated revenue shortfalls. But given the significance of OPEB, both in terms of costs and benefits expected by current and future retirees, the council asked for this Office of Legislative Oversight study to gain a comprehensive understanding on the current and projected OPEB cost and identification of possible strategies to control the growth of these costs. The purpose of today's work session is to have an initial discussion of the data and information included in the report, review the staff recommendations, and hear from the executive branch representatives and discuss potential next steps. As noted in the staff report for the work session, moving forward with any of the report's recommendation will require additional work by the council and the executive branch before any final decisions are made. I do want to thank Mr. Tromka and also Mr. Howard for their very hard work on this particular report. As I said, this is just the first of a series of in-depth examination of our different, not just fiscal policy, but obligations. This is the start of a new administration as well as a new council, and I think it's a very great opportunity to examine what we're doing well, or what we need to tweak. There may be things that we don't need to change whatsoever, but we always need to, check in to see how we can best position our obligations in the position of the county writ large. So that's what we're going to do. I do know that there is a suggested work session structure for my colleagues and everyone to just as guidance. So we're going to hear, we're going to see the presentation from our staff, which includes a summary of recommendations. And then the committee will have, I'm sure, discussion, questions, et cetera. Would like to hear from the executive branch in terms of any comments or any addition, observations, and then we'll discuss next steps and possible timeline as well. And want to welcome all the retirees that are here as well, because of course this is really, really front and center and important, and we always enjoy our luncheons every year where we talk about many of these important elements. And again, just to also reiterate that we understand very well the importance of meeting our obligations and positioning ourselves in the best way possible to do so. So with that, unless my colleagues have any opening remarks, nope. Councilmember Friedson?
I'll just quickly say I apologize for being a few minutes late. I ran a little bit over of how excited I am to talk about strengthening our oversight role with our newly minted Inspector General.
Well, so there you go.
I apologize for that, and I really look forward and just appreciate this ongoing conversation that we're having, and look forward to a robust discussion. So thank you, Madam President.
Councilmember Friedson. Okay, we'll start with Mr. Howard.
Thank you. So we're just going to jump right into the presentation. Before we do that, we do want to thank the executive branch staff from Office of Management and Budget, Office of Human Resources, and Department of Finance who worked with us throughout this project in close collaboration. And the Retirement Board and the Retirees Association as well. And all those folks were invaluable to helping us put together the data information that we're going to present for you today.
Thank you.
So today's presentation will cover several different areas. We'll do, there we go, I have to click twice. We'll go through some OPEB background and fiscal considerations. We'll talk about county OPEB funding and liabilities. We'll provide some comparative information with other area jurisdictions. We'll do a little bit of a deeper analysis into retiree health costs in county government. We'll talk about some OPEB cost control measures in other jurisdictions across the country. And then we'll finish with staff's recommendations for the committee's consideration. So to begin with, what are we talking about when we say OPEB? OPEB is generally non-pension benefits offered by an employer to qualified retirees. And typically, this consists of retiree health benefits. So for the most part, when people say OPEB, we're talking about retiree health benefits. And there are two very important structural components of retiree health benefits that's important to talk about. First, when we talk about what the current benefits are, it's important to note that each employer, so each county agency, sets the OPEB benefit levels, eligibility criteria, and cost share structure for their own retirees. Second, and this is different from with active employees, is the coordination with Medicare. So once a retiree turns 65, Medicare becomes the primary coverage for health and prescription, and the agency plan becomes the secondary coverage. And then also, OPEB includes two funding components, which the committee has talked quite a bit about. We have the pay-as-you-go funding, which is the annual cost of the group insurance benefits for the current retirees. And the agencies budget these costs as part of their budget request. And this is essentially the employer's share of the annual premium costs. And the second component is OPEB pre-funding. And this is setting aside assets at the time an employee earns a benefit to cover costs paid in the future, similar to how we pay for pension benefits. So these amounts are determined annually by an actuary, and the pre-funding amounts are deposited into an OPEB trust that will be used in the future to pay pay-as-you-go costs once we get to a set funding level. So as the council president mentioned, the county has taken our OPEB obligations very seriously, and so we wanted to take just a minute to walk through some of the key events and timelines of OPEB to provide a little more context for the current discussions. So first, we'll begin back in FY03 when the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, or GASB, issued statement number 45. And this required employers to measure and report OPEB liabilities on their financial statements for the first time. In response, the council, through the then MFP committee, established a multi-agency work group to begin working on this issue. In FY8 and FY09, based on the results of that work group, the council adopted a 5-year pre-funding phase-in policy, which then was revised to 8 years, and also each agency established its own internal OPEB trust to place the pre-funding dollars. Of course, then the Great Recession hit, and fiscal constraints resulted in no OPEB pre-funding in FY10 and FY11. And then the council in FY12 established a consolidated OPEB trust for county government, Montgomery College, and MCPS for all the OPEB pre-funding. In the next years, FY12 through FY15, there were some benefit changes made by the agencies to address some of the cost factors and cost concerns. Most significantly, each agency adopted the Medicare Part D for prescription coverage, and this significantly reduced OPEB liability and has resulted in costs today that are much lower than they would have been without this change. Then in FY18, GASB issued statement number 75, and this took the place of statement number 45. And one of the key aspects of 75 is that as of FY18, employers must report OPEB as a long-term liability on its balance sheet, similar to how we were required to report bond debt. And this is different because before, 45 just required it as a footnote as part of the financial statements. And then the last event that we'll talk about more detail later was the savings plans in FY18 and FY19 that the council president mentioned.
All right, so Craig mentioned the difference between pre-funding and pay-as-you-go, and so you might wonder, what are the arguments for and against pre-funding? Well, the chief obstacle to pre-funding is the opportunity cost. Simply said, money spent on pre-funding could be spent for other more immediate needs. And we're going to give you an example just so you see some of the trade-offs. $1 million not spent on pre-funding would pay the salaries and benefits in that year for about 11 entry-level firefighters. So the trade-off shows why it can be difficult to put aside funds for OPEB. Then why fund it if it's so difficult? There are several important advantages. First and foremost, pre-funding costs much less over time. The Government Finance Officers Association, GFOA, they found across the country that pre-funding lowers OPEB costs by about 25 to 40% by means of investment gains. And as Craig said, the county has taken advantage of that. As Craig will explain soon, more than a quarter of our OPEB trust has come from pre-funding investment gains. The next advantage of pre-funding will come up in a second, bond ratings. It protects the county's AAA bond ratings. You know that the rating agencies look at OPEB along with other items such as reserve, pension funding, debt load. Those are measures of the government's credit worthiness. And in recent years, very recently, all three rating agencies have issued statements noting about, generally with governments across the country, how OPEB obligations really do affect credit quality. Another advantage is what we're calling taxpayer equity, and for this we need to make a note. We use the term pre-funding, which is a little bit of a misnomer because what we're paying for are obligations not in future years, but obligations incurred each year as the employee earns the benefit. So really, pre-funding is an operating budget expense that should be paid each year. Paid each year as the employee earns the benefit. Current taxpayers gain from from the services that those employees provide in that year and that you're setting aside the money for. Future year taxpayers don't. And so relying as pay-as-you-go the opposite way is really akin to issuing debt for an operating expense. The last advantage that we're going to list is something that the council president mentioned in her opening statements, that pre-funding protects the benefit for current and future retirees. Setting aside these resources when employees accrue the benefit helps ensure that sufficient resources will be available to pay for future health claim costs. And so for all of these reasons, there we go. The Government Finance Officials Association, GFOA, considers pre-funding a best practice for local governments. So let's talk a little bit about costs. We're going to talk about annual costs, and for this purpose, we're going to look big. We're going to look at the county government, MCPS, college, and park and planning combined. And we're going to take a snapshot of this year. In the current FY20 budget, we've budgeted about $84 million for pay-as-you-go, $121 million of pre-funding, for a total of $205 million tax-supported funding in FY20. So again, to give context, we'll put up this pie chart that'll show that represents a little more than 4% of the total operating budget going to retiree health care. Just add a note with the non-tax supported funding, the total is almost $228 million. And just to put in context, how much is $228 million? Again, we'll do a comparison with fire and rescue. OPEB costs this year are greater than the entire operating budget for fire and rescue in the current year.
So, through the microphone. So now that we've gone through how much OPEB costs overall, we wanted to kind of take a step back and summarize where we stand with pre-funding in our OPEB trust before we get into some of the recent funding history. Since beginning the pre-funding in FY08, county agencies have set aside over $1 billion, and this reflects the commitment of the council, the executive, and the governing boards of each agency to make it this far. However, our total OPEB liability for the agencies is $4.9 billion, which gives us a combined funded ratio across the agencies of 21%, and you can see that the ratio does vary a little bit between the agencies. So we've come a long way since starting from nothing in FY08, but we still have a ways to go. The other component of kind of looking about where we're at is the performance of the Consolidated Trust. So as of March 2019, the balance in the trust comes from $755.4 million in pre-funding deposits from the money that the council's appropriated over the years, and $261.3 million in investment gains. So overall, the investment gains account for 26% of the trust assets, in line with what Aaron mentioned that the research suggests you should be able to achieve. And if this holds, in the future, the county will be paying 75 cents on the dollar for our future retiree health benefits. And that is the primary advantage of doing the pre-funding, is lowering the long-term cost. So now that we've seen where we are from a broad perspective, we'll review the recent funding history over the past 6 years, including the impact of the savings plans in FY18 and 19. And the data that we're going to show in this table is all for the tax-supported agencies combined. And we're going to begin with the pay-as-you-go funding. At the start, before I put up any data, I do want to emphasize that the annual pay-as-you-go costs for current retirees have always been funded in each of the agencies, and there has never been any discussion or recommendations to not, or to do otherwise. So here are the pay-as-you-go numbers during this time frame, and I want to key in on a couple different areas. First, the pay-as-you-go funding for each agency primarily comes from the tax-supported operating budget. However, in each year since FY15, a portion of pay-as-you-go costs for MCPS and county government have been funded with OPEB trust assets. That is, dollars that were appropriated to the trust in prior years as pre-funding. These actions have reduced the annual tax-supported operating budget impact, but have not reduced the overall cost of providing the retiree health benefits. I do want to note that these drawdowns were reduced in FY20, as you can see in the chart, and the fiscal plan recommended by the executive and approved by the council assumes continued progress in this area. The next section I want to highlight is the FY18 savings plan. So as you can see, the total funding, $116 million, did not change between the initial approved and the savings plan approved budgets. However, the funding source did. The savings plan reduced the tax-supported funding by $41.4 million and replaced it by drawing down on trust assets. In FY19, as you can see, there were no changes to pay-as-you-go funding from the savings plan. So now let's look at pre-funding during the same period. Nearly all pre-funding is from the tax-supported operating budget. There is a small amount of funding from non-tax-supported departments such as permitting services and liquor control, or alcoholic beverage services, I guess is the new name, that they contribute on their own. But what I want to highlight here is the FY18 savings plan, where the pre-funding was reduced by $21 million from $127.9 to $106.9 million. And then in FY19, there was a larger reduction to the pre-funding, in total $89.6 million. However, in FY20, we are back on track with approving full pre-funding of $125.8 million. So what is the overall impact of the savings plans and the trust drawdowns over this 6-year period? First, the pay-as-you-go costs, as I mentioned, have been funded every year for each agency. Second, the OPEB trust assets have continued to grow, but they've grown less than was originally planned. Specifically, the net drawdown of trust assets for pay-as-you-go funding has totaled $210.4 million since FY15, and the pre-funding reductions from the savings plans totaled $110.6 million. So combined, the trust has $321 million less than it would have had absent the need for these actions. So the next thing we want to do is show how the county compares with other jurisdictions. So this chart shows 17 public employers ranked by the funded ratio of their OPEB trust. And as you can see, there is quite a range from a high of 77% for Fairfax County government all the way to a low of 0% for Anne Arundel Public Schools. Overall, the county agencies rank ahead or similar to many of the larger Maryland jurisdictions. One data point that caught our attention, however, was comparing the total OPEB liability between Montgomery County government and Fairfax County government, as Montgomery's liability is 4.5 times greater than Fairfax for what you would expect to be a similar size and type of workforce. So as a result, from some of this data, we took a deeper look into the liability data to see if we could kind of see what was going on here. So to begin with, when we wanted to compare liability, we had to go through and understand the factors that can influence what the size of a jurisdiction's liability. And the first of these is the number of members in the plan, and this would include both current retirees and active employees who will potentially become retirees in the future. And of course, as you have more members in the plan, you would expect that liability would increase. The second factor is discount rate. And this is the assumed long-term expected rate of return on OPEB trust investments that is used in the actuarial valuation to determine your pre-funding amounts each year. A higher discount rate leads to lower total OPEB liability since a greater share of the total cost is assumed to be paid from investment returns and vice versa. And actually, the new GASB rules require that jurisdictions with lower funded ratios use lower discount rates than jurisdictions with higher funded ratios. So the good thing about these two factors is that with the data that's available in the financial reports, we can control for them and we can make some comparisons. There's two other factors, demographics and actuarial assumptions, and then benefit plan design and structure. These can vary quite a bit between jurisdictions, so these are factors that we can't control for, but we can look and see if we can figure out whether those might be having some impact as well. So what did we do to create a more apples-to-apples comparison? First, we recalculated total liability using a common discount rate. In this case, we used 6.26%, which is the rate used by county government as part of our actuarial valuation. So we kind of normalized everyone to the same discount rate the county is using. And then we divided by the number of plan members to create a liability per member calculation shown on the far right column. If we focus on Montgomery County, oops, there, our circle's a little bit off there, but if you focus on Montgomery County government, we see that we have a relatively high calculation of total liability per member when normalizing for population and discount rate. So this indicates to us that plan design, eligibility, and/or demographics are generating a higher employer cost per member than in many other local public sector jurisdictions. For some of the other jurisdictions with lower liabilities per member, we did some research to see if we could determine what factors might be causing that. And in Fairfax and Arlington counties, for example, we found that retirees receive a fixed dollar subsidy for retiree health benefits instead of a percentage of the premium cost as we do in Montgomery County. So yes, the liability is much lower, as you can see by these numbers, but it is because they're providing a much lower level of benefit than we are. A second example is Howard County, where they offer set premium cost shares, just like we do, but the difference is that those cost shares are tied to individual coverage only for a specific plan. So in that case, if a retiree chooses to enroll dependents and select family coverage, they would have to pay that entire difference between that cost and the individual cost. So it creates an effective cost share that is much lower for the employer and higher for the retiree. So the last area that we looked at in terms of data analysis was the retiree enrollment and costs for county government to see if we could identify any internal cost drivers that are happening here. And what we found is that pre-Medicare retirees, those that are under age 65, appear to be a significant cost factor overall. Specifically, we found that pre-Medicare retirees represent 34% of total enrollment, but account for 52% of the projected 2019 claims costs. So what does that look like in terms of cost numbers on a per enrolled retiree basis? We found that, on average, pre-age 65 retirees are projected to have claims costs that are more than double that of the age 65 and older retirees.
The next thing we're going to discuss are cost control measures. First is something we've already discussed today, and that's doing full pre-funding. As you've heard, yes, Montgomery County has done better than most in pre-funding. There are, however, out there a few governments have gone much further. And we'll give you an example with the state of Arizona, who has made their full actuarially determined contribution every year since FY08, and now have a funding ratio of 102%. So what that means is they have no unfunded liability. What the state's contributing each year is just what the employees earned that year, and, as Craig pointed out, it's discounted for future investment returns. So by way of comparison, if and when the county gets to a similar level, that alone would reduce our cost by about 40%. The next cost control measure is the modification of the benefit. This is by far the most common. It's happening all over the country as employers grapple with health costs. Many, many state and local governments throughout the county have modified their plans. There are details in our report. We'll just focus for today on what happened here at home, locally. In FY12, the county government, MCPS, the college, they all increased the number of years employees must work to become eligible for retiree health benefits and increased the number of years to receive the maximum employer cost share. In addition, the state of Maryland recently modified retiree prescription drug benefit. And again, many more examples in our report. The next cost control measure is hard to discuss because it's jurisdictions that completely eliminated the benefit. Surprisingly, this has occurred in many jurisdictions. The Kaiser Family Foundation has found that about 1 out of every 3 public sector employees no longer offer retiree health benefits. We've written about this in the report. We don't believe this is something that we would consider here in Montgomery County, so if you're interested in it, read the report. We're moving on because we don't think that's something really to discuss here. But what is interesting to discuss are some things that are a little bit out of the box, at least in our context. And these are some alternative models of providing retiree health benefit. The first one we want to talk about is a general concept called healthcare reimbursement accounts, where an employer contributes to an account to reimburse out-of-pocket medical expenses for the retiree. One of the most popular forms of this is called a VEBA, a Volunteer Employees Benefit Association. What happens is there's a reimbursement account where the employer and the employee contribute tax-free under federal tax law to the VEBA account. The members can choose how to invest their dollars, and the account balances roll over from year to year. Retirees then use that account to pay for medical expenses. And in Maryland, Charles County became the first to adopt a VEBA approach in 2017. Interestingly, VEBAs are the norm in many states, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. So for example, all the way back to 1984, public school districts in Washington state, and now many or most of their local governments, offer VEBA benefits to retirees. The Washington VEBA currently has more than 50,000 members, and what we found particularly interesting was in many Washington municipalities, the labor organizations proactively voted to enter the VEBA. Many of their contracts give the labor organizations an opportunity to opt in or opt out, and they mostly opt in. Final cost control alternative measure, and probably the most intriguing for us here, are something called a private exchange or a marketplace. Again, it starts with a health and reimbursement account where employees contribute. This would be for Medicare eligible retirees exclusively, who could then use the money in the account to shop for customized packages of benefits from a very large selection of medical, vision, dental, and prescription plans. What these exchange or marketplaces do is they pool retirees from multiple employers, often hundreds or thousands of employers. So you're working with a pool that's quite many orders of magnitude larger than any single employer can have, and that could have the effect of driving down costs and allowing for more plan options. In 2016, the Ohio Public Employees Retirement System, they switched over to private Medicare exchange. That exchange now serves 165,000 retirees and spouses in Medicare Advantage, Medigap, Part D prescription plans. The officials there in Ohio, they report that they have more plan options for the retirees and more affordable pricing, and they claim that the transition has reduced state costs by 33%. So we'll conclude by offering our staff recommendations, and as an introduction to the recommendations, goes without saying, this is a very complex issue that affects very many people. And so as you, the council, and other decision makers consider the OPEB policies and practices, of course we need to seek input from current retirees, employee bargaining units, and taxpayers. Our recommendations, we have 4 of them. The first is that the county should align the cost of retiree health benefits with the ability to pay. What this recommendation is, it's really a framework to consider OPEB policy and funding decisions. The concept is that over time, the amount we pay for OPEB should approximate the cost of the benefit, with the goal to decrease and eventually eliminate our unfunded liabilities. How do we get there? That leads to our second recommendation. The council should review and update fiscal policies related to OPEB. The current OPEB policy has not been updated since FY08, and it still addresses how are we going to start pre-funding. So it's very much out of date. What we're suggesting is that the updated policy should consider maybe setting funding goals and milestones similar to what this body did in setting a goal for reserves, a certain amount by a certain time frame. Our third recommendation is to work with the county executive to conduct actuarial assessments of some benefit changes, to look at not only the effect on county finances, but the effect on the retirees and on the retirees' pocketbook. But some of the potential changes that we might have to look at are changes in eligibility criteria, cost share, dependent coverage, plan design, and again, our written report has much more detail about this. Why would you want this information? Information would be helpful, particularly if the county cannot succeed in reducing its unfunded liabilities. And our fourth and final recommendation goes to that medical, to the exchange marketplace idea, that we believe that we should examine the feasibility of adopting a private exchange model for Medicare eligible retirees. We're not ready to suggest that we should do this. We're saying that we're intrigued by it, and we're not expert enough to know what that means, and that we need experts to advise us. If you listen to those who would advocate for it, it's a win-win. The retirees have more choices, they pay less, it costs the employer less. We don't know whether or not to be skeptical or not. An actuary can help us with that. It seems like it's an option worth further study by the county. So again, these are our recommendations. In our discussion, we can suggest some next steps that we think can move us forward, similar to the approach that the council president mentioned. And with that, we'll turn it back to the council president, GO Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Trumpkin. I'm blanking on your name now. I'm looking at you, Howard. I really do appreciate all of this. I think this is a very good framework for us to begin to work on some of these issues. Before I turn it over to my colleague, I think it would be great if we could hear from OMB Director Madalino, so we can have sort of the full presentation, and then we can get into some of the specifics.
Thank you. So much cooler in this building, in another building.
That's good to know. The ladies' restroom on the 5th floor had the heat on, so it depends on where you are.
That's hot air.
Thank you very much. I never know when I'm in here to call you Madam President or Madam Chair. So thank you very much, Madam President, for giving me the opportunity to represent the administration today. Thank you to OLO for preparing this report. And both Mr. Trumpkin and Mr. Howard have been working with us on a variety of issues throughout the summer. And we certainly appreciate the working relationship that we have with them. We obviously, the administration takes this issue very seriously. This is a lot of money. This is a lot of money in any one budget. This is a lot of money from a liability standpoint moving forward. So obviously, we want to make sure that we are working together to protect the interests of the taxpayers. We certainly want to align the cost of the benefits with our ability to pay. When OPEB was established, the county created a policy to phase in fully pre-funding the actuarial determined contribution, which is, as OLO reported, was done in 2015. Since 2015, we have met the pre-funding except for 2 times, and that's obviously been the last 2 years that Mr. Howard highlighted in his graph. I would say in that timeline, the one thing that I wish they had put up there that changes part of this conversation about the liability was the passage of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, which has greatly diminished the increasing cost curve that we were seeing in benefit costs. And I think that was one of the reasons why GASB first put the initial, 45 in place, was to address this issue because the cost of benefits were going up and going up significantly. Fortunately, Congress took notice of that, and after a while came to the conclusion of passing something that has reduced that curve and has modified the increase in benefit costs. So I think part of the rationale for why GASB took action was addressed in a different venue, and we should always remind ourselves and the public how much that law did benefit individuals and organizations like our own in constraining costs, because I think without Obamacare, you would see a very different arc and a very different liability, which gets to part of the conversation we've had before. In establishing the liabilities for OPEB, there are so many unknowns about projecting out healthcare costs over the next 30 years. Probably if you were to go back 30 years from today and think, if you could have thought then, what would healthcare look like? You may not be thinking about what the structure is today. And so projecting out 30 years has a degree of volatility that I think is quite different than projecting out pension liabilities, which are the variables, while still being volatile, are things that we have I think a much greater handle on understanding what drives pension liabilities as opposed to healthcare liabilities. This administration is committed to finding ways to ensure that our retirees and our future retirees get access to quality benefits, quality healthcare benefits, and that we remain able to pay for all of those benefits. As I've tried to stress every time, all of our fiscal actions during the savings plan and submitting the budget, none of that in any way, and I think you heard it from OLO again today, none of that in any way jeopardized any funding for any coverage for any current retiree or future retiree. We continue to make the payment for the benefits for our retirees. It's the question of making the additional payment for the liability. So no one should doubt, I think, the county's commitment, County Executive Elrich, the council members, of continuing to make the payment for our retiree healthcare program. It's just the pre-funding issue. The administration is very concerned and committed with its ongoing relationship with our labor partners. So any conversation about any modifications to benefits, to the structure, to what we're talking about should include labor, and certainly this administration would ensure that labor would be at the table to talk through any changes in the way we approach things. As hopefully you know, the administration is working on a 10-year financial plan that tries to lay out what are some of our structural issues over the next 10 years, what are some of our challenges, and how might we address them. Obviously, OPEB factors into that 10-year plan because the liability is something we carry on our books, the liability is something that we have to disclose, the liability is something we have to address, and we are certainly interested in developing a more complete fiscal policy if that's what the council believes is in the best interest, if that's what our financial advisors suggest moving forward. And we certainly want to work with you, with the council staff, with our taxpayers, and with our partners in labor in order to come up with whatever plan that is moving forward. Obviously, I think Mr. Trumke and Mr. Howard went over an explanation of the limited times we have used the trust assets to pay for pay-go benefits. The bulk of this is the payment that has gone out for MCPS retiree claims. And that is, while that has been a lot of money, it has been a small portion of the trust assets. And I know, as I think was pointed out, we, in the fiscal plan and the fiscal plan that you adopted, we are trying to move away from that process so that we are not using any of the assets. I know the executive is very interested in figuring out what an appropriate level of funded status is. Councilmember Friedson and I have spent a lot of time talking about what is our goal for funding this liability. Is it 100%? Is it something lower than 100%? When is it that we start using assets? Is it a fundamental change in national policy? Is it once we hit a certain threshold? Is it under certain economic circumstances in the county, we would start using assets as opposed to just funding on a pay-as-you-go basis? Because I think as one of the slides that Mr. Trumke put up, that it talked about your pros and cons, that obviously I think the con was the opportunity cost. Every dollar that is put aside in the trust fund is a dollar that is taken out of something else, whether that is a dollar in public service or a dollar not collected in taxes. It is a dollar that could go to some other public benefit. Obviously, and I greatly appreciated the conversation about the difference in benefit structure across the jurisdictions, because I think it's easy to say, oh, look at Fairfax, they're so much lower than us. They have a very different plan design. Our retirees are the people in our community who run into burning buildings, who run into people carrying weapons, who run into families at their worst moment and having to make a decision about whether or not they're able to care for children. I mean, we employ some people who in our community have the hardest jobs that have, as you know, enormous healthcare consequences for the stress that they are put under in having to do those jobs. And that's why I know County Executive Elrich is very concerned about making sure we continue to provide those pre-Medicare benefits because of the health implications that in particular our public safety employees, whether correctional officers, firefighters, police officers, the unique stresses that they experience in their job, which is probably a little bit different than someone like a budget analyst might experience in their jobs. And then finally, we are happy to work with the actuary in going through the assessments. We would just request that there be a little more time spent figuring out exactly what we want to ask the actuary, because the more questions you ask, they're always happy to answer and send you a bill. So refining exactly what questions we want asked would be, I think, the smartest way to approach engaging the actuary so that we can minimize the cost of the actuarial assessment. So once again, I want to thank you for your oversight and your desire to work with the administration to get this done.
Thank you. I do want to make sure that, we continue to have this collaboration. I'm particularly interested in knowing what is the timeline when you talk about the 10-year fiscal plan, as well as engaging with the, actuarial assessment, because I know during budget we did, signal, and we had this conversation essentially. And so it'll be important to know roughly what is our timeline. Let's make sure that we're working collaboratively, because obviously whatever fiscal policy, decisions are made, we all have to, the council plays a very significant role as well. And so, I know we'll engage in more conversation, but I'm just interested in what are going to be our next steps. And I was particularly interested also in our fiscal plan as well, and as Olo had, suggested, that we do need to begin to talk about, what is it that we're going to set as targets, or how are we going to handle this sort of blueprint, if you will, that has been our fiscal plan. But obviously, we need to make sure that we're working in tandem with whatever the administration is doing regarding this 10-year fiscal plan, as well. So I think those two issues, need to be ironed out.
And can I remind everyone that we have a new actuary that will be doing the valuation. I believe we will have the valuation within the next few weeks.
Great.
But this is an actuary that the prior administration, the end of the contract, the solicitation occurred at the end of the prior administration. So I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that, we've brought our own actuary in to change numbers. We went through a process, and that process, in fact, occurred during the end of the last administration. But this is our first full year of working with them. And with any new actuary, they have their own approach to how they do things. So, there could
No,
be.
I appreciate
there
that.
could
I
be
know the
changes.
executive had publicly said that he wanted to take a look at, whatever we had in the fund and how you could perhaps grow that or use that differently. So part of, this exercise is to understand what is it that we're looking at, examining, but we have to do it in a methodical way, because we might have great ideas, and as it was mentioned, even in the report, people might say, well, Fairfax, look at their ratio, and you look at ours, and then you start doing a little bit, digging deeper, and you realize that their benefits are much less than what we offer. So, I mean, this is very important work. Again, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page as we're going through some of these examination, because we're not making any particularly, decisions here to change anything. We just want to first have all the information and examine that. Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you for that. Senator Manalino, you mentioned, sometimes it's hard. She wears so many hats. My colleague, that is it council president? Is it GO chair, Madam Chair? I just prefer to say fearless leader. But thank you for leading this conversation. And during the budget, I raised a lot of concerns about what we were doing to OPEB funding. Not just this current administration, but a vicious cycle that we have gotten into as a county, which I find to be unsustainable, and I think we all agree to it. The council president led the council's commitment to really be serious about looking at this. I understood where my colleagues were on felt like they were being put in a nearly impossible situation, and I happen to disagree with the choice. I know it was a tough choice that the administration had of what to do based on a funding shortfall, and I wouldn't have made that same choice, but I understand why it was made, and appreciate the fact that the council president and the rest of our council colleagues have really committed to this and are now following through on this, and I am hopeful that we can really get serious about it and turn our commitment into reality based on policy. And so I think that's what the real importance here is. I think, as we look at the staff recommendations, I just have to thank the staff. I think that this, again, was a terrific report. I thought your work during the budget process was terrific and incredibly helpful to me and to all of us and to the public of understanding what the real cost and consequences are here. And I think your comprehensive report here, not just in where we are, but what the options are of moving forward and ways to address these issues, which are serious and have broad-ranging consequences, not just to our fiscal health, but to our operating budget, to the services that we provide, to our ability to keep up with those services moving forward. And I think that the way that you framed it was really helpful. I have talked a lot about opportunity cost, and I try to get out of the idea that it's an opportunity cost today of funding our obligation of OPEB funding versus a current year obligation. I think you've framed it in an even better way today of talking about how we're incurring the cost no matter what, that it's a debt that we are taking on based on a benefit that we have provided in the current year. And so it's only appropriate that we would be paying for the debt service on that debt in the current year. And I don't think that's how it is viewed enough. I think that it ought to be how it's viewed. And I think as was raised during the budget process that I had talked about frequently, the 26% of the returns, that's the opportunity cost. We are missing out on making money off of the money, and that is what is really costing us. And so it's really an opportunity cost versus an anvil that is going to weigh down the budget in out years, and the anvil is only getting bigger. And to the point of this only being something that we rarely do, I don't agree. We're at $321 million, as was reported by staff over the last 5 years. Again, not an individual decision made by an individual county executive, but a very difficult cycle that we have gotten caught up in. And I think the whole premise and the whole purpose of this discussion is figuring out how we get out of that vicious cycle. And I think that it's critical that we do. And so I appreciate that fact. I think that the recommendations, the first recommendation of aligning the cost of retiree benefits with our ability to pay, we are all committed to that. I heard the commitment from the executive branch, certainly the commitment of the council. I think that that's the framework that we ought to be attacking this entire problem with. And with the second recommendation of reviewing and updating the fiscal policies, I think we got to do that now. We have to be ready to implement it as we begin to take on the fiscal 21 budget. I think that we can't afford another year where we don't have this happening. And I have to credit my colleagues, the council president, the council vice president, who have been here before I was here, and the council president in particular, who has been leading this committee on the things in the fiscal plan that we have done a really good job of following. And I don't think that the council has gotten as much credit as it deserves on the setting a goal of 10% and achieving that goal with the support and the help of the administration, of slowly bringing down our debt, which we needed to do. The problem here is we don't have a goal. And so we haven't met that goal because the ambiguous idea of funding OPEB is not as specific as the goals that were set with 10% for our reserves and the a specific amount of debt that we slowly wanted to reduce our debt load and debt capacity over a period of time. And so I think the leadership that has been shown has been real, and I think what the one piece that has been missing is setting the target, because you can't hit a goal that you don't set, and we have failed, I think, to set the goal of specifically what is our target for OPEB funding and when do we want to hit it, and then we can judge ourselves to it. The challenge that we've had in these major fiscal decisions, the debt side of things was considered sacrosanct. Our progress towards the 10% was considered sacrosanct. OPEB funding was considered fungible, because what's another year of delay towards a target we haven't set for ourselves? And so, to me, I think that is the key component here. It's less about when that date is. It's less about exactly what that number is. It's more about putting down a marker and sending a message to taxpayers, sending a message to the rating agencies. We have set a target and we are being disciplined in following our commitment to reach that target. That is the missing piece here, and that's what I think this report has really helped us to set a framework of how do we figure out what that target ought to be, working together in collaboration, I hope, with the executive branch, with the actuary, and how do we get to work to make sure it happens? What are the fiscal plan changes that we need to do? What are the fiscal policy and decision points that we need to make? And then, how do we make sure that we, get out of this idea? We talk frequently in government about rainy day funds. The OPEB challenge has become an everyday fund. We wait until the end of the budget year, and then we use it to fund the everyday costs of government so we don't have to make tough cuts. And the challenge that I think that unless we make a commitment that we make these changes this year, we're going to get into the situation where we say the same thing next year that we said this year. We had to do it this past budget because it was a tough budget year, but this year we fully funded it. Well, the reality is most years we fully funded it until the end. And then we cut it. And then we don't actually make the payment because there are other payments that seem to be more pressing in the immediate moment. And that's the area of this that we have to get out of figuring out what's that number. So I'm hopeful to get there. I have a couple quick questions for you, Senator Madaleno, in terms of the issue that you've raised here about what the number is. The county executive and you have said previously that you don't believe that the number, that there was ever an expectation to fully fund the OPEB trust, that the number should be, I think the number was 50% that has been used, and we were told that that was the number that the actuary had shared with us. I have never heard that number elsewhere. Is that still the view of the administration, that the actuaries believe that OPEB only needs to be funded at 50%?
That was, the number I gave you was an informal conversation with the actuary when we were meeting with the actuary, and I asked for their advice because, as you know, and you're always very kind to use my old title, so.
You're senator for life.
Fortunately, our system doesn't work that way. When you look at the chart that that OLO provided, the state of Maryland was sitting at a 3% funded ratio. The state hasn't made a contribution since 2010. So as a legislator myself, and in this sort of arrangement, serving on a body where you can't add to the budget, it never was a question that really crossed my mind of what are we trying to get at when we were still in the low single digits. It seemed like a useless question to say, where are we going when we can't even get the 5%? We, fortunately, as a jurisdiction, are in a different position. Compared to, as I think OLS said, like everyone on the bottom half of that chart is a fellow Maryland jurisdiction that we're ahead of, that this has not been an issue that many people have made progress in Maryland. So where are we trying to go, recognizing, again, as I tried to say in my opening comments, that unlike debt service, where you have a very clear, you've borrowed X amount of money, you've signed on the bottom line, you know how much money you have to pay every year for 20 years and add it all together. It's a very fixed amount of money. The pension liability, again, lends itself to a calculation because the variables that go into it are known. Healthcare, it has a huge unknown in it. I think one of the other charts that they put up where it showed the pre-65 and post-60, the pre-Medicare, post-Medicare number, right now there is a debate going on within one of the two political parties about the future of healthcare, and there's Medicare for all, there's Medicare starting at 55. Imagine what our liability looks like if, I know it's a very big if, but if the political stars align that Medicare starts at 60 or at 55, that changes the liability enormously. Medicare and Medicaid turned into a block grant, and the stars aligned in what I would describe as a nightmarish sort of vision.
Can I ask a
and
question?
that liability explodes. I don't.
So for the administration's planning purposes, are you planning for the expectation that healthcare costs are likely to continue to go up, continue to go down, or maintain the current growth trajectory?
Well, fortunately for us, that is a decision that's made by the actuary, and they present that information to us with their best guess in a non-political way as to what the current environment will be moving forward. I don't think they can, I don't think it would be prudent for any of us to make the assumption of, there's going to be fundamental, if I'm understanding you correctly, there's going to be fundamental change in national policy, so therefore, that's built in.
Well, what I'm asking, all we can do is make decisions
Right,
based
so
on
that's-
actuarial assumptions.
No, but I'm
That's the
just-
game that
so
we're
that's-
in.
but that's what I'm-
So I'm asking if, based on the recommendations that you have from the actuaries currently, is the expectation, because, it seems that the suggestion has been made before. I think it's a far-fetched suggestion personally, because I don't think that hope is a strategy, and it's certainly not a fiscal policy. The idea that we should be planning for a possibility that we are not going to have to incur the full healthcare benefits that we have provided because somebody else is going to provide them. I think if that had been the fiscal policy that this institution had taken, just look at the history of the pension shift from the state to the counties. We would have been in trouble if we thought that we were going to have to pay less. I think the likely scenario is we're always going to have to pay more. And the worst case scenario of assuming that you're always going to have to pay more is you end up with money that can be invested in other priorities. The problem is if we are wrong and we're wrong with too little money, that then we don't have the money to pay for the critical priorities that we have. Then the firefighters that we do want on the streets can't go and keep our communities safe. The police officers that we want keeping our communities safe. The school investments that we believe we need to make in order to keep up. The parks investments that we want to keep up with the quality of life that we have. All the other social services that we want to provide are at stake. So, if I'm making a determination and making a decision here, regardless of anybody's individual political philosophies of whether or not there should be Medicare for all and whether or not we should move Medicare down to 55 and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as as fiduciaries of the public trust here, of taxpayer dollars, we have to side and err on the side of caution. And we have to believe that the likelihood is we're going to be having to spend more, not having to spend less. And if we're banking on the most rosy of likelihoods or possibilities rather than the most likely and the most conservative and prudent of possibilities, then I think we're going to be in a world of hurt. And I think people are going to be in a world of hurt because we're not going to be able to provide the resources that we need to take care of people and to maintain the high quality of life and the high level of services that Montgomery County residents have come to expect. And so I would hope that even though this is really volatile, even though we all recognize that of all the things to determine the actuarial assumptions, that healthcare costs long-term are probably the most difficult, that one, we allow the actuaries to do that work for us, that we not make our own judgments, and that includes my own. But two, that we always instruct them to err on the side of caution, or we take their most prudent, most conservative, most realistic option and not allow ourselves to be caught up in a best case scenario, because I think that's really what has caused us trouble. With the economic downturn, that caused us trouble. We were assuming that things were going to be great forever. And when they were the opposite of great, when they were horrible, we weren't prepared for it. And that's been the whole point and the whole purpose of the fiscal plan and the whole purpose, I think, of the leadership that's been shown by this committee long before I got here and by my colleagues and by the council president to really make sure that we were committing to it. And I think my main point here is the one area that we have fallen short is the one area that we haven't set a very specific target and a very specific goal. And that's what I think we need. And I'm just hopeful that we not get caught up in the large ifs, as you said, the possibilities, but we focus on the immediate serious fiscal challenges that we face and the fact that we are, as was stated by council staff, we are incurring debt every time we tell an employee that in retirement we are going to provide them with a benefit that we haven't paid for properly.
I just, can I just, because I also want to do a time check. I just want to say, this is not a unidimensional issue. To say that we were not prepared for one of the worst global recessions, I think it's really minimizing the impact that so many jurisdictions had to face. And I have to say that, I was here. It was actually my first year on the council when what was in
coincidence.
What pure coincidence, when I was so excited about all these initiatives that we were going to strengthen and expand, and what I was faced with was not only savings plan, but changing benefit structures, progressive furloughs, rebasing the school system's budget. I mean, you name it was done. And so I think that I have to say, I came in here and joined a group of people that were not shy about facing this major global recession head on. And so we embarked in this exercise of making sure that we could set ourselves in the best possible way when other jurisdictions were continuing to struggle. And we're continuing to use things like furloughs way after we were, done with all of this. And so I think setting the targets has been really, really important. But I'll also be honest, during this, last fiscal year operating budget, to find $89.6 million, that was just completely unrealistic. And so, I respect all my colleagues, but the bottom line is that you can't really address that and then look at, education budget or look at, meals for seniors or look at public safety and say we're going to be able to cut $89.6 million because, that's an easy feat. And so I think we are all, some of us obviously have had to make the votes and raise our hands when it came to those very, very drastic fiscal decisions, not politically popular at all, but very important. And I think now we are at a point where we have reached this very important 10% reserve goal, to be able to say, all right, with all the information that we can gather in a very methodical way, what are those targets that we can then start putting in place for this particular fund, which, we did make also some very significant decisions with the Consolidated Trust and things of that nature. But, let's understand that the needs are growing. Our ability to hurry up and make sure that our economic development is as aggressive as it can be, which I find to be really critical. All of those things have to, come into play as we work towards expanding our tax base and also containing our expenses. But it is interesting to also note that, when you look at this chart with Fairfax County, it looks great on paper. But when you start examining the commitments that we have here in terms of our values and how we value our employees, and then when they retire, and we have decided to provide generous benefits for a reason, then we also have to acknowledge and own that, right? So we can't, on the one hand, purport to kind of like beat ourselves up, when in reality we've made some decisions, that are aligned with our values. So I think that Olo's recommendation about starting to look at those targets and building those into our fiscal plan are truly important. And I do agree with my colleague that, this sort of ad hoc thing about, oh my God, we didn't anticipate the shortfall, and then we have, OPIT fund. We can't continue to do that, obviously, that it's just not sustainable, and it just does not help us in terms of understanding where we're going. So I think that, the recommendations that I see here are recommendations that are definitely doable and that we can examine. And some I think is going to take a little bit more, obviously, studying and understanding and our actuaries. Others, I think that, we can safely say that we can begin to establish, especially the targets within our fiscal plan, and let's start building that in there. Because the fiscal plan, as we always say, is a snapshot in time, but it really is a blueprint and it's a guide, so that we can have a sense of where we are going. And also it signals to all our, departments and our partners and our agencies where we might be and where we're headed. I am hopeful that our revenue picture, it looks a little better. I hope that when we have to face this, this past fiscal year, I don't think that we are in this continuing slump. I mean, knock on wood. But I think having those targets would be really important. So I just want to endorse these recommendations as recommendations that we should come back to then and then hear from the team. And then, take those as a committee to the full council to adopt, so we can start, in a very guided fashion, in a proactive way, because, I do have to acknowledge this executive came in, the budget was pretty much done, So this next fiscal year will be a very important year, in terms of budget and in terms of some of those targets that we would have adopted. To guide us, and I think it's a very good opportunity to do so.
So what staff will do is work with the executive branch on moving forward on some of these issues, and then, as you mentioned, we'd bring them back to the committee, for further discussion in with more details. Right now it's a little bit more conceptual, and we want to put some ideas out here and see if this is the direction the committee wanted to go. We can be more specific when we come back, and lay out some different options for your consideration.
And with the direction of the committee, we can also follow up with what the OMB director said, work with his staff to more narrowly define the actuarial studies and get a product that is as lean as possible but delivers the information, and get that back to you.
I mean, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, but that is critical. I mean, that is how we were able to achieve what we did in terms of fiscal policies and our reserves. It was just working hand in hand, with the executive branch. So that, obviously, I hope that we continue to do it that way. Vice President Khan.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. First off, this was a great report. It really was. And not only was it the presentation very clear today, it was really educational, not just for us, but for the public, because this is a complex issue. And you all were able to as much as possible, get it down to a simplistic, and as much as possible, get it down to a simplistic way so that, you know, that even I could understand. Let me say it that way. And I believe that all four of your suggestions are logical. I believe, and Andrew certainly touched on this as well, as did the council chair, that I believe we should be starting to do this right now. I think that the longer we wait, the worse it is for us. I think we should start doing it immediately, the process, and it's because it's not an overnight thing for you to say, okay, they said yesterday we can do this and tomorrow we're doing it. I mean, it's certainly not going to be there. But I do believe that it's necessary to remind all of us, as much as we all have been concerned about debt, we also have to be concerned about what we've done with OPEB. And that this, and OPEB is one of those deals that, you know, before GASB 45 and before GASB 70, everybody didn't do it. I mean, we just funded it the way, you know, pay as you go, thank you very much. We'll worry about that for next year. This is this year, we'll worry about next year. This actually says, you know, there's compound interest. You can actually make some money by saving this thing. Once you start saving money, you know, it starts to get better and better for everybody involved with it. We are proud of what our employees have done. We certainly want to thank them, and to prove that we have a good retirement and give great benefits, and we need to continue to do that. But in order to do that, we have to be prudent on how we're going to fund it. And so I think we should start the process as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, so what we'll do then is that the team will start working on that. We will schedule a follow-up session for GEO. And then also, at some point, we'll also look at those other fiscal areas that, you know, during budget, we said we were going to look into. We're going to look at, you know, debt. We're going to look at, you know, the reserve policy as well. I mean, all these different things, just to have an opportunity to do a check-in and take, you know, look at things with a fresh set of eyes, if you will, and see where we can go. And so, Director Marilyn, I really appreciate, you know, everything that you guys are doing as well, and your willingness to cooperate with us on this. Again, it's the only way that we're going to get it done, and I'm very hopeful that I think, you know, we can make some major progress here by being as disciplined as we can, you know, through this fiscal plan and through all these targets as well. So with that, we're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you very much.